Good morning. Good morning. This is day 2 of being the president. And so Carol Tietzenberg asked me what my official duties were. So let me see. I wrote up the introduction here. And the first thing is to welcome all of you, those here in the audience and those that are live streaming from home. And I want to ask you to remember to take out your cell phones and please turn them off, because that can be very distracting to the speaker when one of your cell phones go off. And if you're like me, we fumble around and look for it in our purse or our pocket or wherever. So just make sure that it's turned off. And let me see, I encouraged people to come in, so that was another one of my duties. And then I needed to prepare these introductions and announcements. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, for those of you who've been in the classes, is it's membership renewal time, and the window for that is closing soon. So if you have not already done so, please consider renewing your membership by July 15th. And if you are a recipient of the HASP happenings, which arrives in your mailbox at 6 a.m. on Sunday mornings, you can renew your membership right there online just by clicking on the icon provided, or you can stop in at the front desk and renew it with Amy, Hannah, or any of our volunteers working there. We also continue to take pictures for the picture directory, and Ralph is here today to take pictures, and you can have your picture taken after the meeting. And it looks like he's going to even take them all the way up to August 6th. But before I go into any other announcements, I would like Kathy Torrey, our new membership chairman, to come forward and announce the new members for HASP. Kathy?
I got to turn this down a little. I'm a little shorter than Claudia. Good morning, HASP friends. How are you today? Good. It's my honor to step into this new role as membership chairperson from Doug Walford, who's done a wonderful job for the last 6 years, and I hope I'll be able to follow well in his shoes. But today we are welcoming, since April 30th was our last regular monthly meeting, we excuse me, we have the following people have entered and joined us with HASP. Nancy Honor, Kathy Esposito, Lynn Beacons, Chris Groth, Deborah South, Karen Dunn, Ellie Bremer, Diane Koop, Chuck Sickle, Lori Fensky, Case Vanderleest, Elaine Vanderleest, Neil Carter, and Mary Carter. And I just was introduced to 2 new people that were guests of Harvey that just joined today. So welcome. We'll probably announce you again next time. So welcome to all of you, and we are happy to have you as part of our HASP family.
Thank you, Kathy. A couple of things for our new members and for our returning members. Remember, on July 11th, we will have our summer sizzle, and that will be at the Outdoor Discovery Center from 5 to 8. So please plan to join us if you have that date available. HASP Beyond the Classroom is going to head up to Muskegon on August 14th, and the time is from 12 to 4. You will go on a bus, and you will see a magnificent show or exhibition, what we want to call it, and it is all the retrospective on John Stuart Curry, and he did the famous painting of Tornado over Kansas. So 5 or 6 of his works are up there. You're going to learn a great deal of information about a man who had a very short lifespan as a painter, but well worth going. So please go to the HASP happenings or the front desk and sign up. And finally, tomorrow, July 3rd, you can begin to sign up for Opera in the Gardens. You will not want to miss this wonderful treat, and it's on August 25th from 12:30 to 11. Now, you see, we're going to be sometime in what I call Michigan time and sometime in Indiana time. But the coordinators have worked that all out. So you don't need to keep resetting your watches every time you are there. You should be just fine. So just want you to know that that's what we're up to. Every Sunday, as I said, HASP Happenings comes to you, and that's really important. So if you are not receiving it, please let the office know, because it is your way to see the week's activities, the classes, and special event signups. And there is always links to it, sign up any of those. Now, before we begin the program today, for all of you who are with us in April and heard Brian Huffman speak, Brian is the marathon swimmer. He made it, his swim across Lake Erie this past week. I think it was Friday. And in our audience, and raise your hand, Ed, is Ed Sherbeek, and he was there on the crew with him, and I encourage you to talk to him. And I believe, Ed, didn't you say you were up, the crew was up along with Brian swimming for 36 hours without sleep, or? Okay. Well, stop and see him if you want to learn more. Brian broke a record, so that is wonderful. Now, the HASP office for the holiday will be closed on the 4th and 5th. And just so you know, next week, Hannah is on vacation. She will return July 15th, and she has gone back to visit her parents in England. So I wish her a well and good trip. It's been a while, and then she will return ready to get back to work. Now, today's program falls on July 2nd, 2024. But we as Americans may not realize how important in our lives the 2nd of July has been to many of us. So let me just take you, and we're going to start at 2002, and I'm going to work our way back to 1776. I'm not going to tell you everything that happened on July 2nd, but I want you to think about some of the things that happened. On 2002, American adventurer Steve Fawcett became the first balloonist to circumvent the world alone. 1979, the United States first issued the Susan B. Anthony dollar coin, making Anthony the first woman to be depicted on U.S. currency. 1964, U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, perhaps the most important U.S. law on civil rights since Reconstruction, and a hallmark of the American civil rights movement. 1962, American businessman Sam Walton opened the first Walmart, then known as in Rogers, Arkansas. It was the start of what would become the largest retail sales chain in the United States. 1937, the airplane piloted by American aviator Amelia Earhart disappeared over the Central Pacific Ocean during her attempt to fly around the world. 1932, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt coined the term New Deal in his acceptance speech for the Democratic presidential nomination. 1881, U.S. President James Garfield was shot on July 2nd and died several weeks later on September 19th. 1776, After a dramatic all-night ride, Delaware delegate Caesar Romney arrived just in time to cast the decisive vote approving the Declaration of Independence. Did you know that Americans' first Independence Day was July 2nd? And that is when the American colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. So why do we celebrate on July 4th? Well, in a minute, we're going to learn, but let me tell you about this two-time Emmy winner and HASP member, Milton Nieuwsma. Nieuwsma started his writing career as a reporter for the Holland, Michigan Evening Sentinel while in high school. After graduating with an English degree from Hope College in 1963, he worked as a public information officer at Wayne State University in Detroit and hosted a weekly radio program called The Fifth Freedom on WQRZ-FM, a Detroit fine arts station. In the late 1970s, Nieuwsma began writing historical features and travel articles for the Chicago Tribune. In 1978, he received a master's degree from the University of Illinois, Springfield. In 1994, while he was teaching journalism at Rutgers University in New Jersey, Nieuwsma met Tova Friedman. And for that, all of us who heard her speak in October are thankful for Milt for bringing her here to talk to us. She is the youngest Auschwitz survivor and inspired him to write Kinderlager. So without further ado, please welcome Milton Nieuwsma, who describes how this happened and how an obscure young Virginian named Thomas Jefferson came to author a paper that changed the world. Milt.
Thank you, Claudia. Good morning, everyone. That was a wonderful introduction. Makes me feel like a newborn baby in a wet diaper. Nice and warm on the inside, a little smelly on the outside, but I'll take it as a compliment. Thank you. If truth be told, I'm not your first choice of speaker today. The first one backed out for some reason, so I happened to be on the monthly program committee, so when this came up, what do we do about July 2nd? I offered to David Blatt, the chair, to do a repeat of a program I did 12 years ago on Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, and without hesitation, David said, "You're on." So here I am, for better or for worse. Let me ask you, how many of you were members of HASP in, I'm talking 2012, 12 years ago? How many of you were not? Oh, good, good. So for those of you who were not, this will be new. For those of you who were, consider this a refresher. Let me pull out my script here, because I don't want to wander too far from it. The older I get, the more I wonder. Since that talk in 2012, a few things have happened as a direct or indirect result. One was the PBS series Inventing America that we filmed here at Hope College. It's been 10 years, actually, since we filmed the first episode. I used a lot of the same stuff in that, especially the first episode on the Declaration of Independence, that I used in my first talk. The other was this book I wrote called Miracle on Chestnut Street, The Untold Story of Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. It covers the period in his life from March of 1775, when he was elected to the Continental Congress. By the way, it was at the same convention in Richmond where Patrick Henry gave his famous Liberty or Death speech. So we're talking March 23rd, to be exact, of 1775 to July 4th, 1776, when Congress adopted his Declaration of Independence. At first, when I offered to David to do this program again, I figured I would read some passages from this book, but I've been to enough book readings through the years to know how boring they can be. So instead, I'm going to assume the persona of Thomas Jefferson and tell his story the way he would tell it in the first person. So what I'm going to do is take you back in time and throw my dignity to the wind and hide myself in this Jefferson getup. Oh, I forgot about this T-shirt. My niece gave me this last year on the 4th of actually on the 3rd of July. You were talking about the second. The third is also important. It has Jefferson, you know, a sketch in the middle. Crap, that's due tomorrow. Thomas Jefferson, July 3rd, 1776. I think I'll wear it in our parade, Idlewood Parade on the 4th. Anyway, I got a, oh. There goes my water. This is the wig. I'll start out with these French cuffs. So bear with me while I get into character here. The jabot with Velcro. Jefferson didn't have Velcro in his day. It'll probably come off halfway through. This is a low-budget production, by the way. And the wig, how do I look? Thanks for your applause, because this is about as good as it's going to get. By the way, I'm not the same age Jefferson was when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was 33 at the time. I'm closer to the age now that Jefferson was when he died, at age 83. So just pray that I get through this alive. Okay, here we go. At 9 o'clock on Thursday morning, I looked out my apartment at 7th and Market Streets in Philadelphia, saw that the thermometer outside my window registered 72.5 degrees, and set out for the Pennsylvania State House a few blocks away. It was the 4th day of July, 1776, and the day promised to be another hot one. On my way to the State House, I stopped to browse at an open-air market, open-air shop on Market Street. I picked out 7 pairs of women's gloves and paid the shopkeeper 27 shillings. Why do I remember that? Well, I noted the purchase right here, along with the date, in my handy little account book that I always carried with me, right here, July 4th, 1776, 7 pairs women's gloves, 27 shillings. To tell you the truth, my thoughts were more on home, specifically my wife Martha, than on politics that morning. And had I any say in the matter, I would certainly have chosen to be home at her bedside at Monticello, not 300 miles away in Philadelphia. Only a few of my colleagues in the Second Continental Congress knew how ill she was, because I was always reticent about my private life. Yet my anxiety about her health was so intense that I had written a letter just weeks before that nearly canceled my rendezvous with world history. In that letter, I urged my neighbor and family physician, Dr. George Gilmer, to find a replacement for me in the Congress. Dr. Gilmer had been chosen to represent my county, Albemarle, at the Virginia Convention in Williamsburg, but for some reason he couldn't make it. So he passed my request on to another friend, his name was Edmund Randolph, whose efforts on my behalf were roundly rebuffed. I still have the letter he sent me. Here it is, June 23rd. I urged it in decent terms, he wrote, but stirred up a swarm of wasps about my ears that everyone seemed suspicious that I designed to prejudice you. So that was that. I had no choice but to stay at my desk in Philadelphia. So there I remained in a constant state of worry about my wife. Now, Martha is probably a mystery to you, but that was how I wanted it. I will tell you what I called her, Patty, but that was a family name. Nobody else called her that. You won't find a portrait of her, but I will tell you what she looked like. She had radiant auburn hair and large hazel eyes. People said she was the most striking woman in Albemarle County. But she was frail physically and had been throughout her life, throughout her childhood. Even so, she outlived her first husband and was a widow of 23, only 23, when I married her on New Year's Day, 1772. If you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, you'll find about 18,000 letters that I wrote in my lifetime, but you won't find a single one that I wrote to Patty or that she wrote to me. Why not? Because I destroyed them. Too personal. I rather like the way my biographer, Dumas Malone, put it. He said, my wife did not belong to posterity, she belonged to me. If that sounds sexist to you, remember we were children of the 18th century. But back to Philadelphia. If you knew about my domestic life back then, which very few people did, I don't think you would have blamed me for wanting to stay home. This was my third stint in the Congress in 13 months. The first time I came in June of '75, it was to fill in for my cousin, Peyton Randolph, who had been called back to Williamsburg to preside over the House of Burgesses. When I returned home in September, I found my younger daughter, Jane, gravely ill. Patty and I had 2 children then, Martha, who was 3, and Jane, who had just turned 18 months. We desperately tried to nurse her back to health, but she passed away that fall. As common as infant mortality was in those days, it didn't mitigate the grief of losing a child. Meanwhile, the Virginia Convention had elected me to permanently replace Mr. Randolph. You might say I came into the Congress through the back door, because it was only through the circumstances of my cousin being called back to Williamsburg that I wound up there in the first place. I didn't know a soul outside the Virginia delegation, and nobody outside Virginia knew me, of course. The only other person in Congress I had heard of was Dr. Franklin of Philadelphia, mainly because of his electrical experiments. I knew about him, oh yes, and John Adams, the country lawyer from Massachusetts. I knew about him because of all the fuss he stirred up when he defended a group of redcoats after the Boston Massacre. So off I took for Philadelphia once again. I left Patty and our 3-year-old daughter Martha with Patty's sister and brother-in-law at their plantation near Richmond Town and hurried on my way. At least I knew they were in good hands. But 2 weeks passed, and not a word. Then a month, still not a word. Finally, I fired off a letter to Patty's brother-in-law. "My suspense is too terrible to be endured," I wrote. And I pleaded with him, "If anything has happened, for God's sake, please let me know it." With all-out war a virtual certainty, Congress abandoned its plans to adjourn in December. But I had had my fill of anxiety, so right after Christmas, I said, "Enough is enough," and I gathered up my horse and surrey and headed home. Back at Monticello, I did little else but take care of Patty the next several months. Thank God she was all right, but our daughter Jane's death had taken a toll on her fragile constitution. In February, I received a letter from my good friend and fellow delegate to the Continental Congress, Thomas Nelson, who urged me to take Patty back to Philadelphia with me. He promised that his wife would take care of her while we went about our business at the State House. I agonized over his offer. Duty demanded that I return to Philadelphia, but Patty was in no condition to make the 7-day trip over dirt roads in a horse-drawn surrey. On the other hand, I wasn't about to leave her alone. Then something else happened, quite unexpected. I wrote it down in my account book so I would remember the date. March 31, 1776. My mother died at 8 o'clock this morning in the 57th year of her age. It was a stroke that claimed her life. Right after that, I came down with a blinding, debilitating headache, what today you'd call a migraine, but we didn't have a name for it then. And it lasted for 6 weeks. Imagine having a migraine for 6 weeks. I wouldn't have wished that even on George III. Wasn't the first one I had either, nor would it be the last. I never got rid of them until I got out of politics. But I will tell you about the first one I had. It was because of a romantic crush I had on a young lady in Williamsburg when I was studying law under George Wythe. Her name was Rebecca Burwell, and I desperately wanted to marry her. She was 17, I was 20. When I proposed to her, well, as my friend John Page said when I showed him the little speech I had carefully written out, he said, "My outpouring of love for the young lady had all the passion of a legal brief." Who else but your best friend would tell you that? So guess what? Rebecca turned me down. When I went to bed that night, her rejection pounded into my head with excruciating pain. So I lost Rebecca, but I gained Patty. Rebecca, turned out, didn't do too badly without me. She ended up marrying a lawyer anyway, and so did her daughter, whose husband went on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name was John Marshall. It was a smaller world in those days. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The reason I know my headache lasted 6 weeks, the one after my mother passed away, was that on May 7th, I have it again right here in my account book, I left 10 pounds with Patty and finally set out for Philadelphia. Well, no sooner had I hit the road, a disgruntled Englishman who had recently immigrated from London exploded into print with a pamphlet called Common Sense. Do you know who I'm talking about? Anybody? Thomas Paine, right. In London, Mr. Paine had made his living as a corset maker. But in America, he set out to reinvent himself as a writer and polemist for the American cause. In his pamphlet, he condemned George III as the greatest enemy this continent hath. Treasonous words, if there ever were. And he called on the colonies to immediately declare their independence. I remember his words. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Mr. Paine's message spread through the colonies like wildfire. When I arrived in Philadelphia, my landlord handed me this letter from John Page, and it was short and to the point. For God's sake, Tom, declare the colonies independent at once and save us from ruin. Well, all we could do in Philadelphia was to wait. The Virginia Convention hadn't yet met, and without their instructions, our hands were tied. I could have stayed home, but I needed something to pass the time, so I sat down and started drafting a new state constitution for Virginia, just in case. As hard as it was for me to concentrate on account of my anxiety over Patty, I did manage to put something on paper. John Page might have said that this too had all the passion of a legal brief, and it probably did. But a few weeks later, it was done, so off it went to Williamsburg. Meanwhile, our instructions finally arrived from the Virginia Convention. And on Friday, June 7th, Richard Henry Lee, a fellow delegate from Virginia, stood up in the assembly room to read his historic resolution, and I quote, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Debate was postponed until the next day. At 10 o'clock Saturday morning, the delegates reassembled. The radicals, led by John Adams, argued ferociously with John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. The issue narrowed to one of timing. The middle colonies were not yet ripe for the break. Better to wait, they argued, than to force the issue and risk secession. To this, the radicals replied that independence was already a fact, that a declaration would merely acknowledge it. The debate rumbled into the night with no end in sight. Finally, on Monday, June 10, the two sides reached a compromise. Postpone the vote for 3 weeks. That would give the middle colonies time to write their assemblies for instructions. But just in case, appoint a committee to draw up a formal Declaration of Independence. 5 of us were chosen for that committee. Like every other committee of Congress, we were chosen not because we had any special talent for this assignment, but because Congress needed to maintain a geographical balance among the colonies. I will say, though, that I had something going in my favor. About a year before, I'd written a paper called A Some Review of the Rights of British America. I had intended this as instructions for the Virginia delegates to the Continental Congress. Although it died on the table at the Virginia Convention, Peyton Randolph took it upon himself to have it published, and copies found their way to the Continental Congress. I know that Mr. Adams was impressed with it, and I suspect that had something to do with my being appointed to the committee. Mr. Adams, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Sir, would you mind joining me at the platform for a minute? I need your help. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. John Adams, my colleague from Massachusetts. Sir, I'm trying to remember who was on the committee besides you and me.
Well, Dr. Franklin was on it.
Of course, how could I forget?
Between the three of us, you, me, and Dr. Franklin, that covered Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania.
There were 2 more.
Let's see, Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Livingston of New York.
Yes, I remember now.
But Sherman and Livingston had no literary talent.
That's right, they were appointed for geographical reasons.
And Dr. Franklin, who did have literary talent, well, remember, he published a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette.
And Poor Richard's Almanac.
Correct. Even though he could write, he unfortunately came down with an attack of the gout.
Too much high living.
No doubt. So the choice, my friend, came down to you or me.
You mean the choice of who was going to write the Declaration of Independence?
That's right. Now let me just say to your friends here at HASP, Mr. Jefferson brought to the Congress a happy talent for composition. His writings were handed about, like the one you mentioned.
Some Review of the Rights of British America.
Right. It was admired for the facility of expression. Although you were a silent member of Congress, I swear the whole time I sat with you, I never heard you utter 3 sentences together. You were so prompt and explicit and decisive in committees and in conversation that you seized upon my heart. Well, the committee Mr. Jefferson spoke of met, and then the choice of who was going to write this document came down to the 2 of us.
I said that you should write it.
You did, that's true, but I refused.
Why did you refuse?
You don't remember?
I don't.
Well, I do. You asked me, what can be your reasons? And I replied, reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular.
You said it, John, not I.
Goodness gracious, it's Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Franklin from Pennsylvania.
Sorry I'm late.
Better late than never, sir. Wait, was your gout bothering you?
No, I was struck by lightning.
Where in the world did you get that wig?
eBay.
eBay. What's eBay?
Would you let me finish, please?
I'm sorry, John. You were saying that you were obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular.
Indeed, I was. I still am. And you were very much otherwise.
I don't think you were obnoxious, suspected, and...
Don't interrupt me. That was just reason number 2. Reason number 3 was that you could write 10 times better than I could. And then you said, well, Mr. Adams, you were more respectful of me back then. Well, Mr. Adams, if you are decided, I will do as well as I can. That's what you said.
Yes, I do remember now. And so I went to work. For the next 2 weeks, before and after the business hours of Congress, I labored over my writing desk at my apartment on Market Street. Somewhere I have the declaration. Here it is. Here it is, gentlemen. You want to see what I came up with?
Certainly.
Your line, Franklin.
Do we have a choice?
Give the young man a break, Ben. He worked very hard on this. So, let's hear what you wrote.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
Whoa. I challenge you to diagram that sentence.
Sir, do you want me to continue?
I beg your pardon. Please do.
We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Strike sacred and undeniable. Too dogmatic. Besides, it's obvious.
Is that the word you want? Obvious? We hold these truths to be obvious?
Are you familiar with Euclid's Elements?
Well, I read them in school, but what on earth does that have to do?
Things that are equal to the same thing are equal to each other. Euclid's first axiom. All of mathematics, he said, is based on axioms, truths that are self-evident. May I see that? All men are created equal. Isn't that also self-evident? We hold these truths to be self-evident. Yes, let that be our axiom. Self-evident.
Self-evident.
Self-evident it is then. May I borrow your pen? Your line.
Go back to the sentence where you talk about the king abetting the slave trade to the colonies. How did you phrase that?
Tell you as soon as I can
Your
find my
line.
page. The Christian king of Great Britain has waged cruel war against human nature in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere.
Yes, that's it. You blame the slave trade on the king. That's a stretch. That endeavor goes back to the 1500s, long before his time, and it's one in which other countries, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, are equally complicit.
You mean the Dutch too?
Absolutely. Moreover, you say nothing of slavery itself. If the slave trade is outlawed, wouldn't the slaves already on our shores, how shall I put it, a more lucrative commodity?
That wasn't my purpose, Dr. Franklin. Slavery is an insult to human nature. Indeed, I tremble that God's justice cannot sleep forever. But the issue before us is independence, not emancipation.
I concede your point.
Mr. Adams, what do you think?
It is good, sir. Your paper is very good. I admire the high tone and flights of oratory. But my concern is not unlike Dr. Franklin's. In your list of charges, you call the king a tyrant. The expression is too personal, too scolding for so grave and solemn a document. But we'll see how it fares on the floor.
Thank you, gentlemen. You may go back to your seats now. Let's give Mr. Adams and Dr. Franklin a hand. Thank you. This is a low-budget production. Over the years, people have asked what my purpose was in writing the Declaration of Independence. What was I trying to accomplish? To put it succinctly, it wasn't to find out new principles or new arguments never before thought of. It was simply to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain as to command their assent. I intended it to be an expression of the American mind. Yet, even as I wrote this document, I had a lurking sense that I was risking my beloved Patty to the cause. To John Page, my old friend, I wrote, "Every letter brings me such an account of Patty's health that it is with great pain that I stay here." To Edmund Pendleton, the new president of the Virginia Convention, I wrote, "I am sorry the situation of my domestic affairs renders it indispensably necessary that I should solicit the substitution of some other person in my place." Along with my desire to express the American mind, I poured deep personal anguish into the Declaration. After I made the change Dr. Franklin wanted, I added some corrections of my own and reported it to the committee. Then it was thrown into the lap of Congress. Mr. Lee's resolution passed on July 2nd. So the fact of independence was accomplished. Now it was time to take up the declaration that would justify it to the world. And I have to tell you, there is nothing worse than turning a room full of lawyers loose on a piece of paper. It was like a pack of wolves. For 3 days, they tore away at it and ripped out words and phrases that I had taken great pains to construct. Out of the 1,800 or so words I had written, they tore out about a fourth, 460 to be exact, including the passage that Dr. Franklin had me read back to him about the king abetting the slave trade to the colonies. For propriety's sake, I sat still and silent. What could I do? The burden of defense fell on Mr. Adams, who jumped up time and time again and fought fearlessly for every word I had written. And I will always be grateful to you, sir, for doing that. At one point, Dr. Franklin tried to comfort me with an anecdote about a hat maker who had made a sign for his shop that said, "John Thompson, hatter, makes and sells hats for ready money." And it had a picture of a hat underneath. Do you remember that, sir? Under all those words, it had a picture of a hat. Mr. Thompson showed the sign to his friends, each of whom criticized some word or phrase. One of them said, "Sells hats, people wouldn't expect you to give them away." When all was said and done, Mr. Thompson's sign ended up with just a picture of a hat and his name. Finally, on the evening of July 4th, the slashing ceased. John Hancock, who presided over the proceedings, called for a vote. Do you know how many colonies voted yes? 12. 12. One colony abstained. You know which one? New York. So many people think the Declaration was signed on July 4th. It wasn't. The vote wasn't even unanimous until New York got their instructions from their convention in New York City, and that didn't happen until July 15th. And then as delegates came and left, it was signed over the next several weeks. But in the meantime, it was printed and read aloud. General Washington read it to his troops at Trenton. You would think that Mr. Hancock, as president of the Congress, or at least Dr. Franklin, who was so well known and beloved in Philadelphia, would have read it in his hometown, but no. It was a tavern keeper. His name was John Nixon, no relation to a future president, who read it to a crowd of 10,000 cheering people from a balcony overlooking the State House yard. But to tell you the truth, my heart wasn't in the celebration. It had nothing to do with Nixon. Not only had Congress mangled my paper, but the letters from home stopped coming again. Finally, on July 15, the same day New York made the vote unanimous, I wrote Patty's brother-in-law back in Virginia. I said, I wish I could be better satisfied on the point of her recovery. I have not heard from her at all for 2 posts before, and no letter from herself now. My anxiety wasn't helped by Virginia's thinning ranks in the Congress. Debate had turned to the Articles of Confederation, and one by one, my colleagues were inventing excuses to go home. Almost before I knew it, I was left as the sole guardian of Virginia's vote. Finally, I issued a plea to another delegate who was supposed to replace me. For God's sake, for your country's sake, for my sake, come. On September 3rd, I couldn't stand it any longer. For the last time, I set out for home. Thank God, when I picked up Patty at her sister's place, she was all right, and we continued on to Monticello and the serenity of our little mountain. That was the place where all my wishes began and where I hoped my days would end. And I decided that politics were not for me, that the rest of the world would just have to fend for itself. Well, that's Jefferson's story. I can't wait to get out of this wig. I made up the last line. He never said that. I mean, the line about Monticello, yes, but not about the world having to fend for itself. He did vow to stay out of politics, though, which of course did not happen. His political career was to continue on and off for the next 2.5 decades. As for the Declaration of Independence, only a few people outside the Continental Congress knew that he had written it. It was never publicly acknowledged until a newspaper in Boston mentioned it in 1794, 18 years later. As late as 1800, the year Jefferson was elected president, he ranked it second in his own list of public accomplishments. At the top was his clearing of the Rivanna River near his home for shipping tobacco. He was still very much a parochial person. He had no sense of what his place would be in history. If Jefferson's preoccupations were mostly domestic, they continued to be dominated by Patty's health. In the first 6 years after he returned from Philadelphia, she bore him 4 more children, but only 2 survived infancy. On May 3rd, 1782, the last was born. The child thrived, but the mother failed to recover. For 4 months, Jefferson nursed her with desperate tenderness. One day, toward the end, Patty opened the pages of Tristram Shandy, a popular novel of the period, and copied the following lines. Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen. Days and hours of it are flying over our heads like clouds of a windy day, never to return. More of everything passes on. That was as far as her strength could carry her. In a clear, firm hand, her husband completed the quotation. And every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it is prelude to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make. On September 6, 1782, Thomas Jefferson recorded the saddest of all the items in his incredible account book. My dear wife died this day at 11:45 a.m. To assuage his grief, he plunged back into the political life he once vowed to avoid. During the next 26 years, he was to serve as governor of Virginia, minister to France, secretary of state, vice president, and president for 2 terms. He never remarried. Of his 6 children, only Martha survived him. Another daughter, Mary, died in 1804 at the age of 25, 2 months after her father was renominated for president. It's a sad irony of history that when Jefferson should have been celebrating 2 of the greatest events of his public life, the Declaration of Independence and his landslide re-election to the presidency, he was privately tormented by anxiety and grief over 2 of the people closest to him. Jefferson himself may have wondered whether his public service was worth the personal price. Had he been home in the summer of 1776 when his wife most needed him? Had he not exposed her to the rigors of the Revolutionary War that afterward attended his term as governor of Virginia? Would she have lived beyond her 33 years? Indeed, if she had, would Jefferson, whose fondest wish in life was to enjoy domestic tranquility at Monticello with his wife and daughters in scientific pursuits, would he have become president? Whatever the answers, Jefferson's last great wish, to live to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, bears testimony to the significance he and the rest of the world came to attach to that document. 2 days before his death, he handed his daughter a poem that read in part, "Farewell, my dear, my loved daughter, adieu. The last pang of life is in parting from you. 2 seraphs await me, long shrouded in death. I will bring them your love on my last parting breath." Jefferson slept through the night. When he awoke, he remarked, "This is the 4th of July. It was only the 3rd. He fought with every ounce of his ebbing energy to live to the great day. Finally, at 50 minutes past noon, on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day he died, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. 500 miles to the north, in Quincy, Massachusetts, his old friend and compatriot in the Continental Congress, John Adams, was also dying. Of all the delegates back in 1776, he had fought the hardest for independence. He too wanted to see the great day. When Adams said his last words early that evening, he didn't know that his friend had died just hours before. But now his words had another meaning. Thomas Jefferson, he said, still lives. Please join me in thanking Marshall Elzinga and Doug Walvard, who played the parts of John Adams and Ben Franklin. Thank you. I told them this might be their big break into show business. This program is being recorded, so we'll send it off to Hollywood and see what happens. I mentioned that the resolution for independence, the one that Richard Henry Lee introduced, passed on July 2nd, not July 4th. So technically, Independence Day should be celebrated on July 2nd, which is today. At the time, John Adams and others in the Congress assumed that July 2nd would be the date we would celebrate the birth of our country. I want to play you a clip from episode 1 of Inventing America called Making a Nation. It's about the Declaration of Independence. In this clip, it runs about 2 minutes. In this clip, Ben Franklin teases John Adams about a letter he had written to his wife, Abigail, after Lee's resolution passed. I think you'll see after looking at this why we celebrate Independence Day on the 4th and not the 2nd. You'll see Jefferson in the background on this clip. He doesn't have a speaking part in this clip. The speaking parts are played by John Hammett and Sam Goodyear, both actors with Colonial Williamsburg, and our own Mark Baer. Mark, are you here by any chance? Not here. He is the moderator, so let's take a look.
We were in haste because Mr. Lee's resolution was coming up for a vote.
And when did that happen?
July 2nd. And it passed unanimously. Mr. Dickinson wasn't there to vote against it.
So that was the day that Congress declared independence.
That's right. That was our first Independence Day, July 2nd, 1776.
Mr. Adams told me of a letter that he wrote to his wife Abigail after Mr. Lee's resolution passed.
Did you have to bring that up, Ben?
What was it you said in that letter, John?
I told Mrs. Adams that the second day of July, 1776, would be the most memorable epoch in the history of America. That it ought to be celebrated with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other from this time forward forevermore. July the 2nd.
Well, sir, you were only 2 days off.
Well, Mr. Lee's resolution notwithstanding, the fact that you celebrate Independence Day on July 4th, not July 2nd, is testimony to the power of the written word.
So, there you have it, the power of the written word. That's why we celebrate Independence Day on the 4th, not the 2nd. By the way, John Tommy, another HASP member, directed the show. Are you here, John? Not here. Daryl Shigardis, another former HASP member who's since moved out of state. He's back here with family this week. Daryl was the executive producer. Daryl, where are you? Give a wave. There he is. Daryl and I are old friends dating back to the first grade in California, and we reconnected at Hope College as freshmen. Won't tell you when, many years ago. It happens that all 3 episodes of Inventing America are re-airing on PBS the next 3 Sundays. It pops up every 2 or 3 years. Watch for it for episode 1 at 3 o'clock this coming Sunday afternoon. Not exactly prime time, so pray for crummy weather so people will stay home and watch. Or you can record it, or you can watch it online. Just Google PBS Inventing America and you'll find it. So that wraps up our program. Thanks for tuning in. You were a great audience. Thanks again to Marshall and Doug for playing John Adams, and Ben Franklin for joining me on this little charade. And remember, today is our real Independence Day, so happy July 2nd.
Milt, will you want to take some questions? Does the audience have any questions for Milt? He covered our history lesson quite well today, didn't he? Very nice of him to have done that.
Thank you.
Thank you greatly for that. So you can start your celebration today if you would like. Now, Milt held up this book, and he has made an offer to HASP. There are a small number of copies, and if you purchase it, all of the proceeds will go to HASP. So I think that Amy had some out in the lobby, and they will also be at the office. So that is that for Miracle on Chestnut Street. I also would like to remind you to sign up for any of the events. And then finally, August 6th, that will be our next monthly program. It will be given to us by Steve Borrichter. Steve's parents, I think I see them in the audience there, are members of HASP. Thank you for lending us your son to speak to us. He is coming into town. He has a role on the Board of Trustees for Hope College, but his role for HASP is going to speak to us on the topic of fusion. Now, I see a lot of heads nodding. My original suggestion to Steve when I communicated was maybe he should talk about, as they do those books, you know, for people who don't understand fusion at all. So we'll see, but I told him to make it so that we can all enjoy his presentation. So be here August 6th, and then after you attend here, you can either vote in the primary before your program here, or you can vote after the program. So have a wonderful July 4th, and enjoy your celebration starting today. Thank you very, very much.